Hey, Bambos.
Hey, Andy.
It's now 7 o'clock, two
Good.
hours later than our normal beginning.
Yeah.
So we'll have to see who joins us and who realized that they came online and we weren't there. Today, we've got Eric Shiner on, and Eric Shiner is a remarkable individual who has spent time living and working in both the East and the West in positions that are very interesting, executive director positions, learning the culture. And we want to discuss with him and spend the hour reflecting on how it is to live and work in different cultures and different societies. And we are going to do that on A Wonderful Chaos. So, here we are, Bambos.
Apparently so, Andy.
Oh, I've been waiting for ages to have this subject on the show. And I got to meet Eric, I guess, I don't know, maybe a year ago. And when I met him and we spoke, I started to recognize something in how we were engaging one another that reminded me very much about my time in Japan. And it was a very grounded way of experiencing the world, far more communal in its way of thinking, not so much independent. It was less I and more we. And when I spoke to him, I realized, wow, I really could identify with his overall way of experiencing the world. And I saw that that experience only comes from having a deep experience in, say, a Eastern country, right? In this case, we would call Japan, which I also spent some years. And when we spoke, and he spent 6 years there. He studied in Osaka, got a master's in art. I don't know exactly what art. We'll have to discuss. Art history. Excuse me. Basically, I just grow really fond of him. He's done so much in his life, which has nothing to do with what we're going to talk about on the show. He's currently the executive director of Pioneer Works, which is this incredible place in Brooklyn, New York, which is combining art and science in a way that's totally remarkable, never been done before. They have a massive space, and they just have 8 different space usages, from art to pottery to music. Basically, they've taken every form of art and brought it in and combined it between art and science. And it's all been started by Dustin Yellen, who is a very well-known artist, and he's now taken the reins. And we may get into that, but the reason why I mention it is because he's on top of an incredible business, and yet he's given us some time to discuss something pretty contrary to that. And maybe it's not. Maybe in a lot of ways we'll see that it's complementing how he lives and works today, which I imagine. But that's really the show today.
Yeah, my first impression of him was, it feels like he's dressed as if he came from there.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, he has this very Zen look.
Oh, nice.
From the hair.
I love it.
Yeah.
So that's it. I mean, I could go into his resume even further. He's worked in Sotheby's. He's been the director of the Andy Warhol Museum for 8 years. I mean, he's done a lot, and yet we're going to talk to him about something a bit different today. And
so he's in a way an artist, right?
I don't know if he would call himself an artist. I would say that he's been part of art and in art for many, many years.
Yeah.
It is his life, and now he's just taking that in a further direction with this new project that he's doing, Pioneer Works. So without further ado, the man, the legend, the myth,
Eric Shiner.
Eric Shiner.
Wow. Hi, everybody. That was quite an introduction.
And quite fair an introduction, wouldn't you say?
I'll take it. Yeah. And you would have really liked my hair years ago. I had a shaved head for 14 years, so I went full tilt Buddhist for a very long time.
Wow.
Now I at least have a little bit of hair.
Yeah, I might have to go there given, what's going on the top of my head at the moment.
I'm already there.
Ronnie's got me taking hair pills every day now. So I got this little pill I have to take each day, which is supposed to grow my hair.
Does she
Oh.
feed them to you?
Yeah, she does, really. She gives me the pill and a cup of water. She's like, take this and this. Yeah.
You're not going to
Nice.
be a balding man.
I don't want to be with a baldy or something. That's her message to me. So Eric, as you probably heard, when we met and spoke, it was clear to me. I think I laughingly said to you after our call, like I sensed in you an understanding that the collective is much bigger than the individual when it comes to trying to get things done. And there's one thing I think you could use words to say it in terms of knowledge, but if you live in a society like Japan, where you feel it, it's part of everything that happens within an organization. It shifts how you see the world. So I was wondering how that was for you in terms of that experience.
It completely redefines how you interact with other humans on every level to really the fundamental core of your own identity. And,
Yeah.
you know, of course, being steeped in Japanese culture and living there for as long as I did for 6 years, I definitely saw that change happen from being the independent, ego-driven American college student in my first go around in Japan to having that completely beaten out of me and thinking first and foremost about the group in all decisions going forward, which is a completely radical mindset for so many Westerners who put the self first and then the group second. But Japan, as we know, is exactly the opposite, the group first and the individual after that.
And how was it for you? Because when I was there, when I first experienced that, it drove me crazy. Like it drove me crazy. And then I started to I learned the language, and I'm like, and now I'm starting to see things going on that I didn't really know were like the first year I was in a zombie-like state, thinking I really knew what was going on. And then I'm like, wow, I don't even need to speak the language anymore. There's like these subtle cues, and it's like this quiet language going on around me. So how was that for you?
Exactly the same, whereas you start off in your Japanese language. And you know, I was doing a homestay in a suburb of Kobe in Akashi when I was there in 1992 to 93 as an exchange student. You are, of course, going in as the independent American, and very quickly you hear the term "ware ware Nihonjin," like we Japanese, and you're like, oh, here we go again, we Japanese.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you start saying it too and start thinking of yourself as part of that group, and all of a sudden it becomes a safety net much
Yeah.
more than an annoyance in so many ways, at least for me, so that I felt very sheltered within this world of care where you're always thinking about everyone in your ecosystem first and foremost, and that you navigate life accordingly. It takes a bit of pressure off in many
It
ways.
does. I think I had probably one of my deepest loving relationships with another person when I understood how much subtlety there could be communicated just through just the eye contact and there was a friend of mine, Hideki, and he was just this lovely. I lived in a little village, so anything you did was really under the eyes of everyone. I was the only whitey there. So I was the only whitey in the little village.
Hmm.
And this guy Hideki had blonde hair and 13 ear piercings, which was just, there was no one else in the city like that.
Hmm.
So when we met, there was a little bit like, oh God, I don't want to be anywhere near this guy just because, he's probably going to be trying to act weird and all that kind of thing. But what happened was, because he knew I was a teacher, at some point he took all the earrings out. He dyed his hair black, didn't talk to me about it. He just said, if we're going to be friends, I need to be kind of visually like, so that no one feels like you're breaking the rules. And that was this kind of weird thing that I'd see happen a lot there, which is just, we know the way the game is played, and this is just apparently what we have to do at this moment to make sure that society is approving of it.
And I had a similar but different experience in that I was the one with the dyed hair and the wild facade, because I realized early on that I was always going to be a gaijin first and foremost, irregardless. I mean, I'm 6'5". I had blonde hair, and I knew that was always going to be the immediate first reaction that anybody would have seeing me. and I decided to test the waters, and that's when I got creative. I had a mohawk, I wore like big sunglasses and cowboy hats, and no one really noticed that level of differential between like boring preppy gaijin that I went in as to all of a sudden like cyberpunk gaijin. It was all totally fine, and no one treated me any differently for being a little bit more expressive. Whereas back home in the States, I would have stood out like a sore thumb and likely had a lot of negative reactions. So somehow the ability to be very different there was totally okay and accepted.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think you also had probably more of a city experience. I was in the village.
Osaka and Tokyo. Yeah.
Yeah.
How did you end up there?
Well, I started studying Japanese very randomly in high school. After my junior year of high school, I was selected as a scholar for what was then called the Pennsylvania Governor's School for International Studies, a program that sadly no longer exists due to budget cuts. And they had several schools, one in arts, one in agriculture, business, and a couple of others. And I had always had wanderlust and was always very interested in global relations. So I applied to the International Studies School and was accepted. And the theme that year just happened to be Japan. It was a 5-week long program at the University of Pittsburgh, where we lived on campus, and we learned everything about Japan, from economics to art to the language. And something about it just completely clicked. And I decided, a year later after graduating from high school, as I was going off to college again at the University of Pittsburgh, that I would keep up with the Japanese language side of things and ultimately study Japanese art history.
Yeah.
Don't mind the silences. We do them a lot.
Yeah, we take it all in. There's no urgency. We're letting everything unfold here. Yeah, when you talk, there's things that I'm keen into that I realize myself, that I'm always feeling that if somebody hasn't immersed themselves in an entirely different culture with different values and norms, that they actually never get to see how much they've been created by their own culture. Because sorry, go ahead.
So true.
So I spent the first year in Japan judging the Japanese. Why are they this? Why does everything need to be agreed with 100 people? How come everyone's deferring responsibility? Why do we need to not talk about being drunk last night? Like all these things that I said that I would judge wrong. And then it took me the year to it was like those 3-dimensional paintings when you blur your eyesight and then you see the thing and you're like, wow, I didn't know what was going on that year.
Yeah, seemingly at all, but once you realize what's going on, it all makes absolute and complete sense. And I only wish that, especially right now, every American especially would be required to spend a year abroad, because we would not be in the situation that we are in now, where people simply are, seemingly, at least some people, very unwilling to learn about others and other viewpoints, other ways of life, other mindsets. And everyone is clinging on to this like notion of what their America should look like. And had they had an experience outside of America, they probably would be much more open-minded to other viewpoints. So
yeah, I've had the same. I've had the same desire. I always think to myself, you can only see the world through this myopic scope if you don't understand how myopic it is. And there's a beautiful cartoon that I've seen on it was basically the Democrats and the Republicans fighting, and then the 2 individuals fighting. Then the scope of the picture goes out: Democrats, Republicans, and then it's the country, basically red and blue, and then you kind of go to the galaxy looking back at this dot as if really this is what we're arguing about. When you think that as we had one guest that said, we're in the only known biosphere in the universe, and we're arguing about this.
So true.
Yeah. I have an interesting story about my time in Japan. When I was teaching, I was teaching at a school in Shinjo-shi was the name of the village. It was an agricultural school, or it was a technical school. I was teaching at basically lower level. They could throw me in, having no education experience in English, because they knew how bad can he do if these kids are only going to be using metal machines. But when I'm sitting there, one of the teachers, each class had the opportunity to do a show or a presentation. All the parents were invited. They all assembly room. The whole place was packed. And the kids rolled in a big screen, and then they started playing a porno movie on the screen, like blaring with the ha, ha, ha. And it just went on for like 5, 10, 15 seconds in the studio. And then all the women, there weren't many, because of course it's a technical, were being harassed by the boys afterwards. And I'm sitting and I'm in love with this teacher that's in that space, and she's getting harassed. So now I'm getting protective, because now I'm like, hold on, this is just wrong. So then I go and I complain to the vice principal, and I said, listen, this is just wrong. This is just wrong. And then, he elevates it to the principal, right? Because he's like, Andy has a point. So then I sit with the principal, and he says, Andy, it's not the student's fault. It's the teacher who is in charge of that's fault. He says, and it's not his fault, because it's all teachers' faults, because we all are part of the same group. And it's not really all their fault. It's my fault, because I was in charge of all the teachers in the group. And so I'm sitting there, and my brain is imploding. I'm like wanting to shout out, no, it's the teacher's fault. He knew what it was. But it was an amazing lesson in how this communal responsibility works. And I don't know if you have similar experiences, or if the story is foreign to you when you hear it.
Oh, no, of course. It makes total and complete sense, because it ultimately always goes up to the honcho, like the top person in the organization, who has to take the hit if something happens beneath her or him. And of course, that goes back for centuries, which is why ritual seppuku and things that have happened in the history of Japan are very real. And that's how serious responsibility is taken. And it's rather a beautiful thing. And if you extrapolate even further, thinking about that level of a sexualized experience in high school, which here would just be completely unthought of, there when you realize many people are reading pornographic manga on the subway or on the train unabashedly in the open, you realize that the views of sexuality and also the evils of sexism play into Japanese society in very real and very spread out ways.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot, is that when you repress a thing, obviously the consequences is that it manifests itself in all of these contorted ways. So,
and there is, as we know, a lot of repression.
Yeah, there is a lot of repression.
That's another show.
Yeah. I mean, I found that the word that, communication, that we drink to communicate, basically the word in Japanese is nomu, is the word to drink. And basically when you drink, it's almost like we give ourselves permission to say all the things that we aren't allowed to say otherwise.
Yeah. And it is automatically, as you hinted at earlier, completely not discussed ever again, and especially not the next day. So you can yell and scream at your boss, say exactly what you want to get off of your chest, and it literally never happened. And that is the social prescription that allows people to vent and not explode, and yet continue on.
Yeah. Wow. It's fascinating. Or even if there's a hookup, like if two teachers, maybe even married, were to have a sexual engagement, it would be as if the next day you go in, you knew what happened. You'd be like, wow, that just, and it was like, it was as if you were in like when Men in Black, when they have that little machine that blinks your erases your past memory. It was almost like, did I have the same night? What happened to everybody else?
Yeah, instant reset every morning. And, we do it in Las Vegas, I guess. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas.
Yes.
And there it just happens pretty much every day with a new reset.
Yeah.
Based on, whatever indiscretion you had the night before, it doesn't exist the next morning. It's really useful.
It is. It's kind of interesting because if you think about would be hard for individuals because Western would look at that behavior through the veil of religious morality.
Mm.
So in that way, it would be, wow, we can't see that it would work in whatever fashion it does in another way in the East, as opposed to us saying, hey, that's just wrong, without even considering that we're applying our own morality to their behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. And, morality is a completely different concept in Japan, which is not steeped in religion per se, but it's steeped in a social bond.
Can you go more on that? Because I'd be curious to hear what you say on that. How do you see the social bond?
Well, certainly, Christianity as a widely influential Western religion is very much based in the concept of sin and the concept of wrongdoing and evil. And even though those tenets do exist in the Buddhist pantheon and in Buddhist scripture and in Buddhist thinking, there is no overriding, what's the word I'm looking for? Requirement to participate in a Buddhist way of life. It's very individual, and it is not a social blanket that everyone has to take part in. And because it's very individual, you're allowed to define how you navigate life, not necessarily through religion, but how you navigate it with your neighbors and society at large. It's, that's complex, but it's not rooted in religion per se, even though religion is very persistent and wide sweeping in Japan and its arts and its history. There is a very big separation between the church and the individual.
Yeah, but I had a strange kind of thing happen, is that I was always wondering, because I didn't see people practicing religion, and yet they were only about religion. It was like a paradox, because you walk into the house, you'd see all of their relatives hanging from the ceiling looking down on them. You'd have the temple with the incense burning. So in some ways there was a reverence to the past, but you didn't necessarily see people pray. It was more like a way of being and not a practice per se.
But you do
absolutely, and it's incredibly personal. And it plugs into much bigger dogma and theology, but it is an incredibly personal thing. And my homestay family, my homestay grandmother was incredibly religious and woke me up every morning at 5:30 with her prayers. But it was a beautiful way to wake up, and then she went on with her daily life, and that was that.
And when you say her prayers, which prayers are we talking?
Well, we had both a Buddhist and a Shinto shrine in the house. It was a very large historic home, and she would do her claps and her chants every morning to deceased family members and to the Buddhist pantheon overall. But that's how she started her day.
Wow. I sent you the book. I don't know if I think the last letter you read some of it, but I had when I went to the Buddhist temple, and then they'd let me go into the center, and then the guy said, "What's that gaijin doing here?" And then the other guy says, "He speaks Japanese." And then, I found it fascinating that in some ways I only got in touch with Japan when I was writing these articles for the newspaper. Otherwise, I wouldn't even seen that the religion it permeated everything. And the ones that were religious were almost the least religious looking. Like the ones they were just you wouldn't think of them as practitioners of anything.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And that shows both how essential it is, but also how personal it is, and also how internal it is, as opposed to it being an external display of your piousness. Which
exactly.
is a very big concept in the West.
In the West, for sure. What would you say, like, the hardest thing for you to get used to in Japan when you were there was?
Well, that's easy. Hitting my head on everything constantly. I think I had a minor concussion pretty much for 6 years. I mean, being 6'5", most
Wow.
doorways in Japan come right across the forehead, and as good as you get at dodging and ducking, there are always incidents, especially when you wake up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom or hungover in the morning, and you just totally whap your head. And I never did get fully used to that. So
Ducking.
yeah.
How was it? How was it to be a foreigner there as well? Because I was in the village, so obviously I was the one whitey, and I couldn't do anything without anyone knowing about it. But you would have still been, moteru, the cute guy that's hanging out, and everyone knows he's the whitey in town. Like, how was it?
Well, I had such a unique, strange experience because first as an exchange student and doing a homestay, I was adopted into a family as though I was a member of the family. All rules to family, responsibility applied. When I
Wow.
went back later for graduate school at Osaka University, I went on a Monbusho scholarship and enrolled in classes immediately with only Japanese students. I think there were 3 Americans at my entire university of tens of thousands of
Wow.
people. I mean, there were very few of us, and I wasn't treated any differently. In fact, my professor told me on day 1, "You're not getting any special treatment as a foreigner. We're going to treat you just like everyone else. So that means your Japanese has to be just as good as everybody else. You're taking the same entrance exam as anybody else, and good luck with that," as it was competitive. And I just had to dive right in, and at least within that structure, I wasn't treated any differently, and it was only in Japanese. I never spoke English. Every single thing I did was in Japanese. Every paper I wrote, every presentation I gave. And I was in intense Japanese language, like super upper level Japanese language classes as well, in order to do that. But that also somehow extended into my personal life in a lot of ways as well, because I made a commitment not to hang out with a lot of other foreigners. I mean, of course, I had a few Western friends just to have my own venting mechanism when needed, but otherwise it was pretty much all Japan all the time, because I didn't want to waste that opportunity by hanging out with foreigners, which I could do at home. So even later on in life, right before I left Japan, I got a job at Diesel, the jeans company in Tokyo, because I had 6 months left on my work visa, and I figured, why not do something fun and completely wild before I go off to graduate school at Yale for my PhD. Last chance I'm ever getting to do this. And I was actually hired, and just like everybody else starting off, I had to wash the windows in the morning, do morning taiso, morning exercises.
Really?
And oh yeah, of course. I worked at a shopping center in Osaka called Hep 5. We had, in its early days, it had what were called Hep boys. And granted, I mean, this is a long time ago, and I was young and skinny and could actually fit into like a spaceman costume. And we would stand at the front in the lobby with little headsets, and we would welcome people and answer their questions about where like the Ganguro surf shop was on like the 4th floor. And it was just super, super fun. There I was very called out for being a foreigner, to be sure. I mean, that was that job because I was a foreigner.
Yeah.
Whereas at Diesel, it was just like, you're just like one of us. And somehow I, because of being a foreigner, became one of the biggest salespeople in the store within like 2 weeks.
Yeah. Everyone wanted to buy from you.
Yeah, because I would say like what I thought and be like, that either looks great on you or that's not so great. Let's try this.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I was selling like thousands of dollars of clothes to one person.
Wow. And your success as a salesperson was a we or not?
No, that was actually very, very, very individual. That's where
Nice.
capitalism does play in, where it's like, it's your number, it's your responsibility. Although we all started the day together, with ritualistic cleaning, ritualistic exercise. That's what morning taiso is to viewers. It's a morning exercise that everyone on a team does together to stretch and get ready for the day. So you start off as a team and a unit, and then you go off and do your thing.
I don't think the Westerners can get their head around doing a group activity because they feel like they're being manipulated into being like part of a bigger group, and that individual streak of the need of the Western society is like, no, it's about me. Like I don't, it's like we breed competition from birth, even in our sports.
Everything.
Yeah. I noticed one thing as well that was the downside of this when I looked at the Eastern, at Japan specifically, is that, and you probably have more experience than this because you were in the higher education, but I was always under the impression that if you studied underneath a professor, you could never write anything that was at odds with what your professor would have written before you.
Yeah, never.
Exactly how we expand knowledge, you're not allowed to expand because it would make your professor look bad.
No, you have to just hone in on one thing they said and then expound on that, and then that becomes your thing, and it's very sequential in that way. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you how many issues I had at the end of the day within the academic system, where you do go in, certainly still as an American, trying to come up with new ways of doing things, and that is not necessarily promoted. So I very quickly learned how to plug the new into the old, and then all of a sudden that worked. But at the same time, when I came back to the United States to do more graduate work, I had the same issues in many ways. So
is that right?
Of course, novel ideas in the academy are, again, not necessarily always promoted. It's keeping the status quo and not rocking the boat.
I wouldn't have expected that. That's interesting. Yeah.
You would think, right?
Yeah, I did this thing with a sumo tournament, right, where I invited all the kids from around Japan to come together, and the guy that supervised me was totally against it. Because as we know in the Japanese culture, if I fail, it's a reflection of him. So he takes it's not me taking the risk, it's him taking the risk, my direct superior. Which is so weird if you think about it in terms of what in the Western society, we'd want to inspire creativity, taking risks and trying to make things expand. Where for him, he was like, no, I want you not to do this event because by doing this event, you may risk humiliating all of us.
Yeah, and especially him. I mean, I was very lucky. My mentor and boss in Japan after I graduated, Shinji Komoto, was the chief curator of the Museum of Modern Art in Kyoto, and I went there to intern with him. And actually, ironically, you're both based in Amsterdam. My first show that I worked on there was Dutch video and photography, and the show was called Still Moving, and we looked at a lot of the big Dutch photographers and filmmakers in that exhibition. But he was always a risk taker, and he always pushed the envelope through art, which is one of the prescribed ways in Japan that you can be different and you can be weird and you can do other things. And the creativity is that vehicle in so many ways. So he always encouraged me to think differently and to buck the system and to do things that would get others in Japan to start thinking a little bit more broadly and independently, as ironic as that is.
Yeah, well, I didn't get that because after I did the sumo tournament, as you probably read, and I was looking for some validation from my boss, after having done it really successfully, CNN shows up, films it, gets a lot of publicity, it went well, and then the best he could do was, you'll never understand sumo.
Absolutely.
I was just after working my butt off, I thought just the little ounce of recognition, and then it was just, you'll never understand sumo. That was the end of our relationship.
He didn't give it to you.
He didn't give it to me, no. And then I think I told him, that was when I said to him, that was the end of the relationship, because I said, you know what? Oh, Jesus, I remember being so angry. I said, You know, the Nanking massacre, your country killed, I don't know what it was, millions of people in Nanking. It is not written in any of your history books. Sometimes you need a foreigner to just to understand your own culture. And then that was like drop the pin. That's the last time we spoke. I sat next to him for maybe 2 months and we didn't even talk after that.
Oh yeah, that's the equivalent of flipping a table for sure.
Yeah.
How do you see emotion fitting in that culture? Because I've never actually been to Japan.
And you said motion? Or...
Emotion.
Oh, emotion.
Yeah.
Well, one of the most important concepts of Japanese culture and how the Japanese individual ego is formed is a sort of two-part makeup of each person. And that is hone, which is your interior self, and tatemae, which is your exterior self, the way you present yourself to the world. Again, we could go into this in an hour-long conversation, but it's the basic concept of exterior self, meaning maybe not really you, and hone, interior self, which is the real you. And those two selves are often in direct opposition to one another. And you might want to, as a person, say, I want to support this sumo competition. I want to support this because it's a great way to share Japanese culture with the world. But the tatemae outside person is like, oh yeah, but this is going to lead to nothing but problems, and this foreigner is going to embarrass me. And that can also shift. It can go the other way around too. So there are the true thoughts of what you would want to do in a perfect world, and then the realities of how you have to navigate society and how you fit into society and how you don't stand out. So that's how you just have to think that you're never quite fully sure which one of those you're getting, which ties directly to emotion. But then you've got the curveball factor of like drinking when it's all emotion all the time. And somebody that you think is the most serious person in the world starts crying or starts making fun of you, or all of a sudden it's pure emotion. And again, that all just fades back inside and goes away overnight. And then off we go again with a fresh day. So let's just say that emotion is constantly going between the interior and the exterior self, and how it can be emoted. And it also has a very great outlet mechanism through after hours social interaction, where that's all it is.
With drinking.
Well, usually.
You know, and the best thing is, if you don't know it, then you go back into that space with the person you were with, say, hey, that was great last night. And then they look at you like a blank stare, like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I also think it's important that, you know, you can't ever overgeneralize. Often. Sorry, I can't speak English after so many years. But there are, of course, rebels within Japan as well who do not play the game and who go against the status quo and do perform constantly and have broken those chains of society in a lot of ways.
Sure. There was something that I loved about Japan, which was the inability to say no.
There's never, as it is often widely said, yes means no, no means no, maybe means no, but no can also mean yes or maybe. And it's much more about the subtlety of the conversation to really determine what someone is trying to say. And if it's maybe or perhaps or so kana ever comes in, that is a no. Like, no way in hell.
And so that was the best. So just for you, Bumbo. So there's this saying, if you say, like when I'd ask if I could do something, so then the response would be, so kana, which, I mean, how would you translate that?
No.
but it is not no. It's like, yes, that's a thought. It's almost like saying, oh, yeah, that's a thought.
That's a possibility that is highly ill-advised.
Yeah, exactly. So,
I mean, the good thing, there is a word in Japanese, mochiron, which is of course.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, you will get, with your inner circle, if you get mochiron, it's like, of course, why wouldn't you? Then that is yes, definitively.
Yeah.
But it's a different word than yes as well.
Yeah.
It really feels though like people live and allow the outer world to define them. Like they're in this structure, and you're constantly aware of how I behave has consequences.
Totally.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
you really think about that strategically in everything that you do. If I do this, then what happens?
Yeah, my brain is trying to differentiate how does that play out in the West, because in the West also people are afraid to show themselves, but it's not about social structure, but it's about being vulnerable, right? Like we don't want to share the tender parts of ourselves in case we get judged. Where over there you might be an outcast.
I mean, it's very much rooted in Western vulnerability, to be sure, where you do think about what others think, but you don't necessarily adjust your own actions to make them think better of you per se. So it's much more about what if I do something wrong, or what if I don't keep up with the Joneses. It's much more about comparing yourself to others. Whereas in Japan, it's not about comparison, it's about conformity,
Nice.
which is different.
Yeah, that's what I found so fascinating, is that really everyone was spending all of their time thinking, how do we make sure to keep the harmony? It was all about harmony and not about excellence or expansion or what are we going to achieve. And I think it's interesting because if a Westerner goes into that society, given the values that they're raised with, it's really hard to understand how that way of living can be so beautiful.
Yeah,
Because
it takes
the easiest
study.
Yeah. And also the quiet, we said earlier that in my experience there, so much was not spoken. If you've ever, of course you've seen Japanese films, they're like quiet and you'll just see the facial expression, and it's through just the behavioral changes that you say, oh, I know exactly what's going on here without him having to speak a word. And that for me is clearly just reminiscent of all of my time where the quiet speaking was far more powerful than any words that were ever spoken.
To be sure. I mean, the subtleties involved are just, so meaningful in and of themselves. And as long as you take the time to tune in, it's all right there. But I think this is the main reason why many, many Westerners go to Japan for their first time and just really don't like it at all. And, whether it's the film, what's the film? Bill Murray.
Oh yeah, Lost in Translation.
Lost in Translation. For many, that is the experience that people have with Japan, which just seems so completely impenetrable and unable to be understood, because you're there for a very short period of time. Whereas if you go and you really start to absorb and just be that observer, those are the types of people that do better in Japan and do tend to bond with it. And, some of us stay.
Yeah. I noticed the ones that stay, there's also an aspect of when you're Westerner there, you are in some way special because and I've noticed at least the people that I was with that stayed, I tended to see they attached to the idea that they like to be special, where they weren't necessarily special in their own country.
Yeah, that has a lot to do with it as well. And it's also one of the reasons I left, because I could see myself one day becoming one of these old white guys who dresses in traditional garb from the 19th century and teaches flower arranging and tea ceremony, as there are many, especially in Kyoto, of scholars who have retired to Japan, who have written exceptional books on Japanese culture, and in many ways have become the arbiters and the gatekeepers and the flame keepers of true Japanese culture, which is completely bonkers that, this certain group has really taken on keeping tradition alive in Japan in a lot of ways. I never wanted to be that person because I don't view that as necessarily authentic.
Yeah. Yeah, I had the same experience. I needed to leave. I had 2 years. I could have stayed a third year, and I was like, I'm too comfortable now. It's just too comfortable. Like if I'm here, like there's no challenge in this anymore. Even though it's totally great, but there just wasn't the challenge.
No,
There's
same thing. After
yeah.
6 years, I had a job offer, and I had to make the decision to be a curator at a prominent museum in Tokyo, or come back to the States to start my PhD at Yale. And I realized if I stayed in Japan, I would be in that job at that place for the rest of my life. I would become director one day, most likely. And that just was like, no, I have more to do, more to think about, more to achieve. So I left. I still go back as often as I can, get my fix, and that's good.
There was a word that I really keyed into when I was there, and it was Ishin Denshin. And it's funny because I've spoken the word to Japanese people, and they look at me like it's like they don't place much value on that word. Although I placed a hell of a lot of value on it because it encapsulated what I felt like I was experiencing, but no one else was able to see there because they lived it. It was just part of their lives. And so Ishin Denshin, I'm sure you'll probably have a better definition for it, but it was an acute empathy to the point when you felt as if you could read one another's minds because you're so in tune with the greater whole that there's an understanding you have just through your sort of, call it your vibration of how you're interacting with one another.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what it means. It's like that connectivity that is inherent within the group structure, like literally like a sharing of souls kind of concept.
And I don't think Westerners get that.
No.
Like
some.
Yeah, I mean, like it's almost funny because we do like authentic relating here in Amsterdam, and we do kind of activities which create this connection. And I'm always laughing because I'm like, yeah, I lived in that society for years where I felt what that felt like. So to create a contrived environment to emulate it, it's like, wow, I can also do that, but I know what the experience is just to live it as a daily experience.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, in so many ways, Western culture is bereft of the notion of harmony and peace and oneness. Certainly, our connection to nature is nothing compared to Japan, where convening with nature, with aesthetics, with harmony in general, and this is prescribed from early age through life. And it is something that we don't spend a lot of time on.
And you can see it, it's reflected in their reverence towards nature.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, even calling it Fuji-san, the mountain it's given elevated status.
Yeah, an honorific title.
Yeah, an honorific title.
I'm wondering what it's like being with you guys now, for a Japanese person to, when they're in the West, like go and study in the States and be like 18 and being in these in this educational system. Like that must be mind-blowing.
Oh, I mean, for sure, because all of a sudden you have all of these freedoms, and you don't have to check in with anybody. And a lot of people, I've had a lot of friends who were exchange students over the years who all of a sudden want to be in that group, and the group is usually like American kids who are studying Japanese, where they're very comfortable and still have a semblance of home, a semblance of Japan, and want to be part of a group, because otherwise it can be incredibly lonely.
Yeah, it's interesting because on one level, you could imagine that it would be easier for a Japanese in some ways to come to the West because whatever they feel like they weren't allowed to do, they're now allowed to do.
Yeah.
But then do they do it?
I don't know.
Most that I know have, certainly. And that's also one of the reasons they left, because they did want an added level of freedom, to be sure. So that's, I think all of us who decide to live abroad and study abroad have something that we don't necessarily like about our own circumstance, whether that
Yeah.
be family, whether that be society, whether it be politics, and we go very far away to experience another reality. And the same
So,
is equally true.
yeah,
You're living in Amsterdam.
exactly. I left the U.S. at 20, and I have no intention of returning
I
anytime
might,
soon.
like, if you know of a flat, let me know.
How did the experience you had in Japan, and of course all the things you picked up while you were there, impact you today when you're now leading a pretty dynamic group? I mean, in some ways you can see a strange paradox going on because you're in a group. Dustin, who is the one you work closest with, his mind doesn't stop. It doesn't say, let's do what we did yesterday because it's comfortable. Like, he's shooting through the roof of creativity on a daily basis.
Sure.
And so how does it work when you're balancing someone with that much creativity and drive with the being at peace with this moment and helping everything, like nurturing it? Like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, luckily, I've always remained a hybrid between America and Japan, and I've taken the best attributes of both cultures, I hope, to inform my own career and my own way of dealing with others. So that allows me the flexibility to shift as necessary, but especially the Japan experience gives me the groundedness to deal with absolutely anything and never be stressed out. I mean, if anything, people are constantly shocked at how difficult it is to really like get me to like be ruffled and actually show that. I mean, I might be a little bit stressed on the inside, but Japan has a very good way of just creating that harmony internally that you just, almost go into a meditative but conscious state of just letting this go. And there are so many great kotowaza, which are sayings in Japan, like water off a duck's back. You just let it bounce and roll. Or when someone is being annoying, you say it's like speaking Buddhist scripture to a horse. It like has no effect. So you just let it roll and let it bounce off. So all of those many years in Japan, where I did practice meditation and Buddhism to a certain degree, not as a religious experience, but as a way of life, that has proved incredibly useful in all that I've done, and that it allows me to just remain calm and deal with things as they come, while also being American and being really innovative and thinking entrepreneurially and not being risk averse. So somehow it all rolls in together pretty well.
Yeah, because I've seen that. I mean, especially in your role, you're an executive director of a company which was begun by someone who's got a big, strong position in the world. He's known, he's a brand, and basically, I was really like impressed with your ability to say, okay, I'm going to complement that energy because I'll have to have my own energy. So that was where I laughingly said, "Wow, you're going to have to balance. How do I create him as part of this bigger picture and me as prominent within it?" And for me, that is the East and the West together.
100%, because it is about individualism and the person, but it's not necessarily about ego.
Yeah.
And I just wish more people in the art world were less ego driven and more either action driven or results driven. It is one of the biggest problems of the art world that is so fueled by ego and being that big fish in the big pond or the small pond, wherever you happen to be. But it being about you, my work has never been about me. It's been about the organization or the art or the group or the team, because that's what matters.
Yeah, and there's a selflessness in that obviously, when people talk about great leadership, it's weird because they'll often be parroting back very Eastern-like ways of philosophy.
Yeah.
I personally am more of a fan of benevolent dictatorships because I also have a feeling like I also feel like group think has a stagnation to it because deferred responsibility and inability to come to conclusions. So I am, I must say, I'm still probably in the dark ages, and there'll be people that come and tell me, no, Andy, you really don't understand groupthink enough, and you haven't been in a structure that allows it to fester or, create it. But I'm very much a benevolent dictator type. Yeah.
Yeah. Usually decision by committee, especially in the art world, does not result in anything worth remembering. And I think that it's about creating a happy balance within a culture where people's voices are heard and listened to and incorporated into various aspects of an organization. And once a decision is made by those whose role it is to make said decision, either artistically or business leaningly, then that is it, and you move on together and hopefully create a happy equilibrium therein.
Nice.
I'm
a little bit curious. The Eric that left and went to Japan to live, and when he came back, how did your family, like, did they like treat you like the old Eric, or was there space for the new Eric to be there?
Well, I mean, that's a very long story, and that's like 5-hour conversation. But and Andy and I also have a lot in common on that front as well. But
just read the book, Last Letter.
It's kind of weird how many similar experiences we've had. But my mother, of course, when I came back, was just expecting the same old me to come back, and I was radically different. But she's luckily very flexible and very go with the flow. So she just, very quickly let that new person in, and that was pretty much a non-event.
But Dad, on the other hand,
long story.
No, I got it. I had the same, of course. My dad really didn't like any traits that I brought back from Japan. He had a lot of judgment towards other cultures because he felt like they didn't embody this, the direct. And my father was just emotionally abusive. He needed to say everything so directly that if he felt like you'd obfuscate or not be direct, that he would get angry. It was literally like, you have to be speaking like we do here, get to the point, and all that. I have a funny experience is that in Japan, after I finished, I became a director of a company in Austria, and I had the hardest time looking at people directly in the eyes. Because in Japan, you just don't look at people directly in the eyes.
It's like looking at a bear. Like, don't do that.
So I go into European culture from Japan, and now I evade eye contact all the time. So I find out many years later that all the people I was working with don't trust me because they say, hey, you never looked at me in the eyes. He said, when my Spanish partner always said, it took me years to trust you because you would never look at me in the eyes.
Always adjusting.
Always adjusting. Yeah. Something quite beautiful about the things you pick up, you don't even know you pick up until you've spent some time with a new group. Only then do you realize how much you were influenced by the old group.
Oh, 100%. And, some things go away and some things stick. I mean, to this day, I still bow often, especially when I'm talking on the telephone. I still bow because that's what you do in Japan to show that you're paying attention. And that carries through to virtual conversations as well. So I still do that all the time. And those are just things that are now a part of me.
Yeah. I think that's something that's fascinating that you wouldn't know unless you had seen it, is that if a Japanese person is, if you're in a conversation on the phone, they'll be bowing in the room that they're in, even if there's several people, not saying a word. So you're kind of strangely confused, like, hey, he can't see you. Why are you bowing?
And what you do.
It's just what you feels like it's an intention.
Yeah, and the beauty of it is that I'll often talk to Bambos about this sometimes, because Bambos will sometimes, during a long episode when we talk information, he's not always information interested. He's like, give me the heart. Let me see where people, I want to see the heart of an individual. Don't give me any. So he'll just sit there like straight face. And the funny thing is that I'm always wanting him to give the Japanese acknowledgement, like, because in Japan, there's the weirdest thing that happens if you're a foreigner talking to a Japanese person. You'll get on the phone, and unless you grunt, they assume that you're not there because that's what they're so used to. So you'll get on the phone, listening to them. They'll get on the, hey, how are you? Da, da, da. Are you there? Are you there? Like they'll ask you if you don't grunt. So
Yeah,
it's you need to grunt.
Luckily, I have stopped grunting because when I came back, people are like, "Why are you grunting all the time?" So you have to stop doing that here. Whereas if I'm ever on the phone speaking in Japanese, I still do it. It's just ingrained. So
yeah. And so that's why I do it. That's what I'll nudge you to start acknowledging now. I'll have my own sign for you. This is the moment that you go like this.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I know this has absolutely nothing to do with your current workload. So I'm so grateful.
Love it. Well, that's not true. We actually have a show of Japanese cinema from 1968 up at Pioneer Works right now, and we'll be reopening after Labor Day with that exhibition, which had all of 4 days runtime before we had to close.
And what films were you showing? What films were you showing?
It's a group of artists who were radical filmmakers in Japan. The movement is called Expanded Cinema, and the exhibition is about that movement and the filmmakers and artists who took part, and very much tied up to the student riots and the realities of mass social change in Japan in 1968 specifically. So it still comes up. We're always thinking about potential shows of Japanese artists down the line. So Japan will always be a part of me and will always play out in various ways.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing part of that journey with us today. We have Magda. Magda is one of our watchers. And when she says, enjoyed this interesting, beautiful talk very much, thank you. She's our voice of approval from the outside. So
I love it. Thank you, Magda.
Thank you, Eric. Love you. We'll talk, of course.
Thank you both so much. Love you too. Have a great night.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey, that was fun.
I got some Japanese culture.
Yeah, you can probably see why I love it so much, I guess. Is there anything that came up for you that was interesting that you didn't know?
I think not really, because I did study in Oriental medicine for 6 years, and it was Japanese based. And even though the head teacher didn't speak English, but we had an Italian teacher who was Dutch, and he spoke English to us and Dutch.
So in a way, I guess, even if you're not in the country, you still gather what the principles are that they live by.
Like from preparing the food, there was so much respect, and like separating the colors, the flavors, to getting up really early and meditating, and not so much humor, like no jokes, really. And when he would talk, he owned the room. Like as a Westerner, you could feel you don't want to say anything because he could
top you.
Yeah.
He was the sensei.
Yeah.
Wow. That's nice.
Yeah.
6 years. You've got such a fascinating background. You've done so many things that you don't do today, that any single one you could do as a yoga teacher, a Chinese medicine teacher. What other things have you learned for extended periods of time?
And cooking. I haven't food poisoned anyone yet.
No. Well, it was great.
So thanks for as we did this show, I was actually rethinking the chapters in your book.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, if you see someone like Eric, I mean, he got much deeper into the culture than I did. And when I get to speak with someone who has a shared experience like that, it really connects me back to, I would say, another part of my brain, which feels very, very comfortable. You're really I was very comfortable in Japan. There's this communal way of seeing and experiencing and living, looking after everybody's own, not your own interest, but the group interest. And I think if we look at the Western society today, we could use a bit of that in our thinking.
Here.
So we are coming to the end of another week, and we've got Sana Kole on tomorrow. How cool is that?
It's going to be episode 69, guys.
Wow. And she is going to talk about, I've got ADHD.
Yeah.
And I mean, how sweet and beautiful is it she's coming on? She basically has said, you know what? I've got this diagnosis. I posted on Facebook. I reached out to her. It's always easier to post on Facebook than it is to have a conversation online. So for her to do that, that takes a lot of strength.
And knowing her, I think it's a very vulnerable thing to do.
Yeah.
And I know that she's got a lot of courage.
She's got a lot of courage. So I'm really looking forward to being with her in that. And yeah, thank you for being with us, guys. It was an incredible show. And I look forward to seeing you then tomorrow on
A Wonderful Chaos.